The opening chapters of Genesis show us the wisdom and the beauty of creation, while at the same time revealing the power, even though it's limited, but revealing the power that sin has over this world. In Genesis chapter 4, we come face to face with the terror of knowing what the world is about. Now, it's not all bad. On the good side, Adam and Eve are faithful to God's calling of multiplication as they produce 3 sons. And we see the development of the family lineage. On the less than good side, Cain follows the pattern set forth by his parents as he acts faithlessly, engaging in willful sin and then lying about his actions. God's judgments against him follows a pattern as well. The Lord's rebuke is as swift as it is devastating. He is cursed, his future labor is complicated, and he is forced to flee to the east, just like his parents did. The chapter simply gets worse from there. So as we think of Genesis 4, just a few observations. First is what we might call the downward spiral of sin. Now, speaking of sinners, the prophet Hosea would later write, "They sow the wind and they shall reap the whirlwind." In other words, your actions, in this case, Cain's wrong actions, will grow and multiply and produce a sort of crop of wickedness. So look how this plays out in the lineage or in the family of Cain. His descendant Lamech has the horrible distinction of being the first person said to engage in polygamy. Polygamy, a practice that most certainly fueled marital conflict, the conflict that was part of Adam and Eve's curse. Moreover, he composes a song for his wives in which he boasts about killing a man who had wounded him. In doing so, he mocks the grace that God had shown his father Cain by reassuring his wives that he would avenge himself 77 times if he was provoked. This thought of grace leads me to my second observation. Listen, Cain deserved to die. The appropriate penalty for murder, as the Bible later reflects, is death. Yet God spared his life. Now, certainly God's judgment against Cain was harsh, but it wasn't immediately fatal. Lamech likely saw this grace as weakness on God's part, even as a license to kill. But the grace that God extended to Cain was, just like it had been for Adam and Eve, an act of mercy. It was an act of mercy that was intended to inform and transform their lives. And so it is for even us today, as Peter would later explain. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards us, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. God's patience is a reflection of his character, but it's not to be assumed or trifled with. For at the exhaustion of his patience lies his wrath. The third thing that I would point out is that we have seen God's personal grace given to Cain and even to Adam and Eve with the birth of Seth. But in this chapter, we also see God's general or his common grace. That is the sort of grace that he extends to all of his creation. The sort of grace that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount when he says in Matthew chapter 5, "For God makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and God sends rain on the just and the unjust." Now, God demonstrates this kind of grace by laying the groundwork for a system of justice. He punishes Cain, but he also protects Cain. He puts limits on what other people can do to him. God disallows any sort of mob violence or justice against Cain, and in doing so, God is providing a sort of template that he would later clarify in the Mosaic Law. Now, later on in the New Testament, Paul tells us that governments are established by God, that they are a, quote, servant of God for the avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. In this way, the rule of law is a good thing, for it promotes the welfare, it promotes the good of society by causing people to pursue wise justice. Now, all of this is a check against the sort of downward spiral of evil, and it is therefore a means of God's grace. God created us as an expression of his love and his joy, and he delights in us, and therefore he is unwilling to abandon us to our own devices. In his wisdom and grace, he intervenes for our good. We'll see this even more clearly in the next few chapters. But for now, as you read Genesis chapter 4, it's worth asking the question, how has God been gracious to me? And I guess I would challenge you to use your answer to direct your prayer and your worship even today.